Hello and welcome to another edition of Another Book Review. This week I'll be reviewing Lawrence Wright's look at the history of Al-Qaeda, the Looming Tower. I'll start with a brief introduction of the author, go into what the book is, talk about what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it, who I'd recommend the book to, and finish off with what I'll be reading for next time. Lawrence Wright is, and I don't have a cover to share, unfortunately I did read this on an ebook. Lawrence Wright is a staff writer for The New Yorker. He is also a novelist, best known still for writing this look at the history of Al-Qaeda. He also wrote a book concerning Paul Haggis and Scientology called Going Clear, and this was made into the Looming Tower was made into a show on, I believe, Hulu a few years ago. But this is still the best thing he's known for doing. And it is a look at the history of Al-Qaeda from roughly the late 1940s to right after 9/11, and is a very, very thorough look at the people involved in that. So we have, and I will just acknowledge right now my pronunciations may be off here, so I do apologize if I mispronounce any of the names, but it's basically taking a look at um, the theory underpinning beliefs of the ideology that became pan-Islamic terrorism as perpetrated through bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri, beginning with, I believe, Sayyid Qutb is the gentleman's name, who was an Egyptian writer in the 1940s, and how that influenced a whole generation of people, including Ayman, and the formation of these movements, all the way up to the war in Afghanistan, where the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, the bond that was made there between Saudis like bin Laden and Egyptians like al-Zawahiri, and the kind of splitting up of their paths for a while, then coming back together, and then really formalizing Al-Qaeda in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and then everything that came after that. So it's a very, 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 very thorough look at the lives of these people, um, where their beliefs came from, why they believed what they believed, as well as uh, um, the failures of the United States government, the federal government, to stop this from happening. Excuse me, these terrorist attacks, including the U.S. Cole, but also then later, more importantly, 9/11, on a much greater scale, 9/11, and he follows John O'Neill, who was one of the folks who was tasked with finding bin Laden and putting an end to him, and just the whole intelligence apparatus, both from the FBI and CIA, and a large part of the book that he talks about in the beginning is how failures for the FBI and CIA to share information was one of the major underpinnings of why the 9/11 attack was able to be executed. Um, so that is the book, and it's like I said before, if I didn't underline or stress this, it's very, very, very well researched. Lawrence Wright talks to many, many, many people, and it's a very, very, very thorough look at the lives of the people involved. You have a lot of, I think he was able to interview many people who were close to Osama bin Laden. He was able to interview Jamal Khashoggi, who had interviewed bin Laden, I believe. And so through that, you really do see the thought process and understanding of what bin Laden was trying to do. You also see kind of some of his uh, psychological underpinnings, how religious he was, how not religious he was, and I thought a really interesting way. Um, he writes Lawrence Wright. Lawrence Wright writes in a very journalistic manner, so everything is very, very brisk. There's not a lot of inserting himself in the story, which I appreciated. It is a little bit of a long book, and there are parts of it where I was a little confused at times, but on the whole, there's a lot of information in there that I've found things that I didn't know before. There's always a question of how much money did Osama bin Laden have? Was he a billionaire? And you kind of learn through the history of his family that his dad, he was one of many children, but his dad was essentially a construction magnate in Saudi Arabia when the country was modernizing, and because he was able to start a construction and infrastructure company, was able to make a lot of money. Bin Laden was able to, as a child of that money, fund a lifestyle where he was able to make millions of dollars. It wasn't like hundreds of millions of dollars, but it was enough to fund some of these terrorist actions. And he basically had a company of his own that he did work for. There was a time in his life where he was in Sudan, and he had invested a bunch of money into the country, but was able to, unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, but he was forced out of the country and was not able to recoup a lot of that money. Basically, was ripped off by the Sudanese government before his exile there. But there's a lot of things like that that I just didn't know. There's always a question of how much involvement he had in the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and Wright stresses in that part of the book that the Afghans really fought against the Soviets. These outside forces from the rest of the Arab world had come in and were training to help the Afghans, but that was relatively their involvement in the war was relatively minor. So this kind of Osama bin Laden being kind of a turning point in that war was not really so much the case. He was able to fund people and made a lot of connections that would later be important from that time. And his involvement with the Saudi government and their working with him at that point was kind of part of the lionization of him, and he had gained a lot of fame from that action. The other big thing that I didn't know that it was really interesting was I never really pieced together how important the invasion of Kuwait by the Iraqis was in this whole in Bin Laden's kind of underlining thinking of America being a impediment to worldwide Islamic rule. So basically, a pan-Islamic movement, and wanting to basically have one world government ruled by Sharia law was ultimately what he was trying to do, and he saw America as an impediment for that. I think also rubbing salt in the wound was America being on the Arabian Peninsula, in that area of the world. There was a point where in the early 1990s, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait, and there is a fear by the Saudi Arabian government, because they're a relatively uh, small country as far as population, that they were going to be overwhelmed. Bin Laden goes to the Saudi Arabian government. He's Saudi and has connections because of his background with the Saudi Arabian government. Basically says, "Hey, we can fight we can fight the Iraqi army with our soldiers. Don't call on the Americans." There's roughly 50,000 soldiers that he feels he could muster against an Iraqi army that could have been up to 1 million people should they have invaded. The Saudi Arabian government makes a decision to allow the Americans to come in, and this basically angers him for a very, very long time, and I think is really probably the point in not to conjecture, but I think that's really the point in which that this whole thing kind of hinges, where he really feels insulted by that, and he goes on and makes America a target of his attacks, starting with the bombing of the USS Cole, but also continuing with, I believe there's some East African embassies that were bombed, and then the USS Cole is bombed, and then finally 9/11 happens. And so there's all kinds of things in the book like that, where you learn about him and the organization, and the thought process, and kind of the why and how they were successful, where and how they were not successful, the ability for them to really just last essentially is they're able to fail and learn from their failures, and they are able to bring in outside folks and basically have a training base, and this enables them to, for not a lot of money, carry out these attacks. And so all that was really interesting. The part where he talks about the failures of the FBI and the CIA to work together, uh, based on really some understanding of laws that were written in the mid 90s, federal laws that were written in the mid 90s. That part was a little bit less interesting, because it's just kind of like watching people fail over and over again. Knowing what is going to happen is not necessarily the most exciting, but it's important to understand the failures of the federal system, and why a lot of what was happening was about jurisdiction failures, or failures between the NSA, the CIA, and the FBI to share information, and how that kind of led to Al Qaeda being able to carry out this attack. if you want to read one book, this is the one to read if you're at all interested in learning about this. And I think, like I said, dispelling some of the myths. I enjoyed it for what it was. It is a little bit of a longer book. There may be some places where you could cut. I personally didn't need to know about, Osama bin Laden as a father. I think there are probably some people who would be very, very interested in that, though. I understand why he put it in there. Um, Other than that, I think most of it was important. I don't know how much other stuff I would have cut from the book. There are places where it's not quite clear where Osama bin Laden is getting his money. Like I said, he was kind of kicked out of a couple different countries and moving around. This is in the late 90s, and so it's sometimes unclear where money for certain things is coming from. But overall, I enjoyed it. I would recommend to anybody who wants to know about uh, this point in history. I think it's a really interesting look at how um, where America was in terms of intelligence and where we are now, and the ability for the government to safeguard its citizens and kind of the underpinnings of this ideology and where that comes from. I think that's all really important to understand. Um, yeah, Lawrence Wright, The Looming Tower, would recommend it to anybody who's interested in this period of time, excuse me, or Islamic terrorism, if that's something that you're just have no knowledge of and wanted to learn about. I think he does, in my opinion, provided that Lawrence Wright is writing with accuracy. I think he dispels the idea of the possibility of 9/11 being an inside job. There are probably people who would read this and point flaws in his reporting. There are probably people who would read this and maybe look at the CIA having been really very, very secretive in case the CIA knew something that they didn't know. So I guess there is that possibility, but otherwise, the likelihood of that happening is pretty slim. But anyway, I recommend everybody to check it out. I think it's as well done as you could have done it, with some minor caveats that I mentioned before. The Looming Tower, Lawrence Wright. Next, I'm going to be reading the newest Anne Patchett book, Tom Lake. Until next time, please, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please like the video if you haven't gotten a chance to, and I will leave my Twitter link below if you want to check that out there. Until next time, bye.